Good evening, everyone. I hope you enjoyed your holidays. I'm glad that you're back with us tonight. If you remember our last session, I said that we'd begin looking at the Middle Ages this week. We kind of did an overview last week, and now we're diving in this week. The timeline of the Middle Ages kind of varies from person to person, from different historians. Just kind of depends on who you ask. But as far as how long it lasted or what was included in it, but it's pretty much unanimous across the board that the Middle Ages began with the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 AD. A lot of things happened leading up to 476 that brought about the downfall of Rome. But 476 really serves as kind of a hard endpoint and a good date to remember as the sort of endpoint for Roman rule in the West. So before we dive into what became of Rome, let's take a moment to remember what Rome once was. At its greatest extent, under the Emperor Trajan in 117, Rome stretched from Armenia to the Atlantic. The Roman army had large numbers of trained, supplied, disciplined soldiers, which they drew from an ever-growing population. They had a comprehensive civil administration that was based in thriving cities with very effective control over the public finances and the public treasury. Among its literate, educated elite, the Roman way of life had sort of ideological legitimacy because they saw it as the only worthwhile form of civilization. And there was sort of a cultural, unity based on Greek and Roman literature and rhetoric. The power of the empire across its holdings allowed it to maintain extreme differences of wealth and status, which obviously included slavery on a large scale, and its wide-ranging trade networks across Europe and even Asia permitted even modest households to use goods from all over, made by professionals far away. Its financial system allowed it to raise significant taxes, which, despite widespread corruption, which is really an understatement, supported a large regular army with logistics and training. A series of military and administrative posts that were put in place and organized for members of the nobility ensured that powerful nobles from across the empire became familiar with both military but then also civil command structures and administration. A large number of the centurions, these leaders within the Roman army, were well paid, very literate, educated individuals that were responsible for training and discipline and leadership in battle. The individual cities under the Romans, their governments with their own properties and their own revenues, functioned very effectively at the local level. There was a series of emperors who each adopted a very capable successor, and because of this, the empire didn't require civil wars, unlike many of their neighbors, as far as regulating the succession from one emperor to the next. Requests could be submitted directly to the emperor, and the answers had the force of law, which put imperial power directly in touch with even the most humble subjects of the empire. But despite all of this, Rome remained a culture based on a subsistence economy, largely an agricultural economy, with no, in particular, great understanding of disease. Despite all of their aqueducts, which there were hundreds across the empire, the water supply had terrible hygiene, and sewage was disposed of on the streets, in open drains, or even by scavenging animals. There was always the possibility of local harvests failing and causing famine across the empire. And if you can kind of remember this from when we talked about the context way back weeks ago, even in good times, Roman women needed to have on average 6 children, each in order to maintain the population. Good nourishment, bodily cleanliness, things that we take for granted today, were really just privileges enjoyed by the rich. It's not to say that it was impossible for someone of lower status to be well fed and bathed, but it wasn't common, certainly. Infant mortality was very high. This is a time when things as simple as diarrhea were a major cause of death across the empire, across the ancient world, really, but specifically in the empire. Malaria was endemic in many areas, especially in the city of Rome itself. And so it all really starts to spiral during what's called the crisis of the 3rd century. The Sassanid Empire, which was in Persia, inflicted 3 absolutely crushing defeats on Roman armies out east and remained a potent threat for centuries, well after Rome had fallen. There were civil wars, at least 4, to different degrees, at least 4 different civil wars across the empire. Barbarian invasions, widespread famine, mass deaths during 2 different plagues. And so as these, in particular, these Germanic tribes begin to develop agriculture, or at least develop better agricultural practices and grow in size, they really have become these ever-present threats to the northeast and in Germania, which is Germany, but it's also further than that. It's further into Eastern Europe and up partially into Scandinavia, at least. And so these ever-present threats, eventually they begin to invade. For example, Britannia, so Britain, the British Isles, the province of Britannia, which at the time only included England and Wales, and stretched almost to Scotland, was already, before the crisis of the 3rd century, the most expensive, but also the most untamed province. And so at a certain point, to put it into perspective, at this time, Britain and Wales in Britannia were full of gold, full of iron, tin, silver, a lot of metal and mineral resources that made it very valuable for at least a couple of centuries. But these were overtaxed. The veins of gold and silver and other metals ran out. And so eventually Britannia couldn't produce enough economically to keep up with what it cost to maintain it. At one point, it cost 4 times as much to maintain it as what the actual economy was producing. But there were also constant clashes with tribes to the north, the Picts, the Caledonians, different barbarian tribes, as we'd call them. And then even within the province itself, the Britons, the native tribes there, under Roman rule, often fought against the Roman forces, particularly for the same reason that they would actually go on to fight the later Christian kingdoms, because they were trying to impose their religion on them. At first that was Roman paganism, then it became Christianity, and so they fought back against that violently. And so right in the middle of all of this pile of chaos, Germanic tribes from the east sailed across the English Channel and invaded. The Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes, all of whom came from northern Germany and also Denmark, invaded all of them almost simultaneously. And Rome eventually, within about 3 or 4 decades, evacuated all of its troops and civil administrators, and then left Britannia to its fate. And so, side note, you may have already guessed that the Angles and the Saxons do in fact go on to merge and become the Anglo-Saxons. And we'll talk more about them in a later session about some things concerning them in a few hundred years from now. But this is just one example. The Franks are another example. They came from Germania. They invaded Gaul, so France. They would go on to dominate Western Europe. And eventually they would produce Charlemagne, the first Holy Roman Emperor. And we'll talk about them later on as well. The Gothic tribes, so that's the Goths, the Visigoths, and the Ostrogoths. I don't know why there's all these different Goths, but they are. Would be the tribes that would be primarily responsible, at least militarily, for the majority of Rome's fights on its borders, and then it was a Gothic invasion that was the final nail in the coffin for the city of Rome, but then also for eventually the West as well. And then on top of all of these Germanic tribes invading all across the provinces of Rome, the Huns ride into Europe from Central Asia, the steppes of Central Asia, and they begin to slice through the Roman armies in the north. They reach the gates of Rome itself. From what we can best tell, the only reason why they didn't sack Rome was because the Pope paid them off, basically, to put a fine point on it. So all these successive invasions by all these different tribes were a chief reason for the West's fall, but they were not the primary reason. Because see, by the time the West fell, it had already been split into western and eastern halves of the empire. And that happened as early as 293, so almost 200 years prior to 476. And even though on paper they were technically still one united empire, functionally they were separate states. Outside of Rome, the city of Rome, and then a handful of other urban areas, the western half of the empire was largely rural. If you can see the map on the screen, the orange part, that is western. That's what the Western Roman Empire, and so they own parts of southern Europe, a lot of the Western Mediterranean, so North Africa, Hispania, Gaul, a lot of places that are not heavily urbanized at this time. It was just as multicultural as the East was at the time, but a majority of the peoples that were under Roman rule in the West were farmers, all kinds of different farmers, but farmers nonetheless. And the economy after the empire partitioned became almost exclusively agricultural as time went on in order to support the army. This was already like this when it was a united empire. Most things were done for the benefit of the army, but it became even more so as time went on in the West. But Rome, as we've mentioned, was being chipped away at constantly by all these Germanic tribes, the Goths, the Visigoths, the Alemanni, the Huns. The armies of Rome keep losing battles, and Rome keeps losing ground little by little. The East, on the other hand, didn't have nearly the problems that the West did. The East had already long since been widely urbanized under the Greeks and the Macedonians. I mean, centuries and centuries prior. If you can think to all the cities that Paul visits in the New Testament, there's so many cities, many more urban areas in the East than there are in the West. The economy of the Eastern Roman Empire was unparalleled in basically the entire Western world, primarily because Constantinople was a trade nexus at which nearly all Roman trade routes to the east went through, which includes the all-important Silk Road that connected and funneled all the trade goods from the Asian states, so India, China, Southeast Asia, etc., westward towards Rome. And so, in other words, basically all goods of significance that were going to east or west started in the east before they made it to the west. The east was also vastly more literate, more educated than the west. Didn't mean everyone was literate and educated, but on the whole, it was more literate and educated than the west. Most of the great works of art and literature and science and then theology for our context with the church came from Constantinople and the cities of the east. And also the East was just much better about defending itself from outside threats than the West was as time went on. And it wasn't because the East had a massive army or the world's, most highly trained soldiers or anything like that. It was primarily because even before Rome in the West fell, and then especially afterward when it was just them, the East relied on diplomatic relations, alliances, and peace treaties with their neighbors to ensure their security and then just peace in general in the regions. So the Eastern Roman Empire would serve as really the dominant economic and cultural power in Europe for almost the entirety of its existence. From the time that Constantine builds and dedicates, Nova Roma, so Constantinople, in the early 300s, all the way to the Crusades. Although this would eventually tail off from the Fourth Crusade in 1204 till the time it falls to the Ottomans in 1453. And so now I think would be a good time to go ahead and take a break. So we'll go ahead and do that. We'll come back at about 6:56. Okay, so we're back. We've been talking about what all the things that contributed to Rome being in a spot, just a terrible spot, really. The East was fine, the East was great, but the West was shoddy, to say the least. All of that we've already talked about, to say conditions were ripe for the decline and fall of the West and then the rise of the East. And so, having said everything that we've talked about, how did Rome fall? Well, as we established in the beginning, but we'll come back to now, there's no one reason why the West fell. There's no single cause that you can point to and say, "Yep, that's it. That's the one." The West fell for several reasons. We already talked about the damage that the barbarian invasions did to the Roman army, but then also the cities of the West, including Rome itself, which was sacked twice just during the 5th century. Once by Visigoths from Gaul, and then once by Vandals from North Africa. And that is their name, Vandals. That's not just a nickname to call them. We also know that the Roman economy was in poor shape. It was full of corruption from the top down. It was overly dependent on agriculture to sustain the army. We also discussed the crisis of the 3rd century, which had a tremendous effect on the overall stability of things in the West. But there is one reason, which I don't really believe is a legitimate reason, but it is a reason suggested by several historians that they chalk it up to, and that is the rise of Christianity. The theory sort of goes to the effect that because Christianity came to be celebrated and funded by the highest levels of society, including the emperor, the seat of the emperor himself, and because its peaceful message counteracted really centuries of this sort of Roman pagan warmongering, funds began to be shifted from the army to the church, which I do think probably happened to some degree. But then also Roman society began to soften and diminish, which I really don't think happened as much as they say that it did. And so to frame it this way, to quote one historian who advances this theory, as the happiness of a future life is the great object of religion, we may hear without surprise or scandal that the introduction, or at least the abuse, of Christianity had some influence on the decline and the fall of the Roman Empire. The soldiers' pay was lavished on the useless multitudes of both sexes, who could only plead the merits of abstinence and chastity. If the decline of the Roman Empire was hastened by the conversion of Constantine, his victorious religion broke the violence of the fall and mollified the ferocious temper of the conquerors. And so, to put too fine a point on it, basically it's the assertion that the Christians turned the Romans into weenies, into inadequate fighters and sissified people. And for the record, this theory, including the quote I just read, is largely advanced by anti-theistic, atheistic historians. So we can cut through the bias there and see the heart of their complaint, obviously. Obviously, I do think the rise of the church changed things at all levels of society. I don't think that can be argued. But I don't think it's even slightly logical to pin the Roman army's myriad defeats all on Rome embracing Christianity. I don't think that's logical for a second. So how did it specifically end for Rome in the West? Let's look back to the date I first brought up, 476. And let's bring up a name you've probably never heard before. Odoacer. Odoacer was born into a Gothic tribe in eastern Germania, but he eventually went on to become an officer in the Roman army. But around 470, 471, the dates are kind of fuzzy, he switched sides to the Germanic tribes, and he took command of a group of tribesmen that was formed from several different tribes, who went on to fight through the Roman forces and make it to the capital. By this point in 476, or at that point in 476, the capital of the West was not Rome. It was the city of Ravenna, which is in the northeast of Italy. And it had been the capital actually since 402. And the transfer of the imperial court from Rome to Ravenna was made partly for defensive purposes. Ravenna was surrounded by swamps and marshes, and so it was believed that it was easily defensible. And it's also likely that the move to Ravenna was because of its large port and its good connections to the Eastern Roman Empire via the sea. By this time in 476, the 16-year-old Romulus Augustus, who would be the last Western Roman emperor, was on the throne. He was not qualified. He did not succeed to accede to the throne in the proper imperial way. He was put there by his father, who was a general in the army. Odoacer's army goes on to invade Ravenna, and they force Romulus to abdicate. He wasn't executed, but he was sent into exile with family. And so Odoacer declares himself king of Italy, and he sends the imperial insignia, that last symbol of Western Roman power, to Constantinople. And so, for the first time in roughly 450 years, Western Europe is not under the rule of Rome. And new kingdoms begin to pop up from the remains of the old territories of Rome. Europe begins to reshape its boundaries as the barbarian tribes that are now running free make land grabs and they war against each other. You begin to see people like the Anglo-Saxons, the Franks, the Visigoths grow tremendously in power and shape great kingdoms. But amid all that turmoil, the Eastern Empire remained strong and powerful. And Constantinople and the Eastern Roman Empire, or the Byzantine Empire as it's more popularly called, will rival the economic and cultural might of all the kingdoms of both Europe and Asia for over 900 years to come. But what does all this mean for the church? Rather than just making it a dry history lesson, how does this apply to the church? Well, it means a few things for the church. First of all, the Patriarch of Constantinople becomes perhaps the most important religious figure in Europe for several centuries, primarily through the backing of the Eastern Roman emperors. And the greatest works of theology and the greatest churches built in Europe in this time are built predominantly in the East. The Pope still resides in Rome, but the papacy, the office of the papacy, really declines in power and in visibility for at least a few hundred years, at least until close to the coming of Charlemagne, the king of the Franks. Second, Christianity doesn't stop existing in the West. Because the church had enjoyed so much support from Roman society and the Roman emperors and wealthy nobility for so long, it was able to engage among other things, serious long-distance missions work across the continent and the British Isles. And, if you can believe it, the majority of the barbarian tribes that defeat Rome in the West are Christians. The church in the West still receives financial support after Rome falls from the rulers of Italy and the other various kingdoms across the continent. And the Pope is still seen as the head of the church in the West. Third, we begin to see kings in various kingdoms, particularly the Anglo-Saxons and the Franks, and especially under Charlemagne later, begin what we know today as Christianization of the pagan tribes. And this isn't done through missions or evangelism. These were done. Missionaries did go to the pagan tribes and did make many converts. But this was not how Christianization was brought about. The defeated peoples at the hands of these various kingdoms are given the choice to convert or die. And many of them refused and did die. Alongside this, the church begins to encourage the leaders of the kingdoms of Europe as it did under the Roman emperors and would continue to do for centuries, to basically wipe out any trace of the existence of these tribes. Well beyond just getting rid of their pagan religion, but erasing their cultural practices, even erasing their language. I will say this as an aside. We obviously don't believe that ancient pagan religions are equal to Christianity or they're worth giving a bunch of praise to. We obviously don't believe that. And so I can certainly understand to a degree the desire, quote unquote, to convert them. But I think we need to reject in entirety any efforts then or in the present day made to wipe out the cultural heritage of a people group. A heritage that may stretch across hundreds of years, thousands of years even. I realize that's a sticky subject, but just because a lot of what makes up these cultures is intertwined with their religious practices, but I do stand by it. And finally, even more greatly than before, the church begins to align and ally itself with the ruling states of Europe. Before, at least from a human perspective, an external perspective, and stay with me on this, Christianity kind of fell butt backwards into becoming the state religion of Rome. Obviously, that's not how that happened. This was the providence of God to bring his plan to fruition in spreading his church this way. I'm just saying from a human perspective, outside of a Christian perspective, it kind of just seemed like Christianity lucked out into becoming the state religion. And so that's happened. But now, driven primarily by the papacy, the Western Church begins to ally with the various kingdoms of Europe and become entrenched, really, in their societies at all levels. And on a larger scale, across the continent, this marks the beginning of what begins to take root, but then eventually blossom into the Crusades. And that is the church using the power, the military power specifically, of these different states to manipulate the political landscape in Europe and beyond. This is why so many kings and so many members of nobility across Europe will go on to sign up to fighting in the Crusades, even financing their campaigns by draining their kingdoms dry with taxes. It's also part of what ends up causing so many other religious wars during the Middle Ages, even between Christian states for over 1,000 years to come, well beyond the start of the Reformation. And it's also the driving force behind the existential conflict between Christianity and Islam, which obviously has continued to the present day. And so that's what we'll get into next week. We'll take a look at how Islam came to be, who Muhammad was, what made Islam spread so quickly across the world that it almost came to dominate Europe itself, fewer than 300 years from its foundation. I will give a preface for that now and then also next week. We will, to at least a degree, be looking at some aspects of the theology and the practices of Islam. It certainly won't be a deep dive. We won't spend the whole time talking about it, but we will look at it. And I apologize in advance if you don't like hearing about Islam, certainly learning about it, much less, or if the idea of talking about it, learning about Islam at all is somehow offensive. But in a course that looks at the history of the church, it's somewhere between irresponsible and borderline impossible to teach the history of the church faithfully and avoid the topic of Islam. Obviously, I'm not endorsing Islam or saying it's equal to Christianity or anything like that. I simply want to examine how Islam affected the church during its earliest days and sort of set the stage for what we'll particularly see in the Crusades. And that is the violence with which Christians responded to Muslims and vice versa. So if all that's too much, obviously feel free to skip next week. Otherwise, I hope you'll tune in again, and we'll see you then. Have a good night.